Iran and Russia are certainly not an alliance.
Russia supports axis of Islamic resistance.
Iran has a history of being skeptical about Russian intentions when it comes to mediation.
Russia can't afford losing another important partner in its anti-Western coalition.
Welcome to the Carnegie Political Podcast. I'm Alex Gabuev, Director of Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center in Berlin. Today's episode is dedicated to the crisis in the Middle East, war between Israel and Iran, the role that the Kremlin is trying to play, and broader impact on Russian interests in this pivotal region and beyond. My guests are my Carnegie colleague Nicole Grajewski, who is a fellow at Nuclear Program and follows Iran closely, and Arkady Mil-Man, a senior researcher and the head of Russia program at the Institute for National Security Studies at the Tel Aviv University. From 2003 to 2006, he was Israeli ambassador to Russia. The events are moving very fast, so it's important to know that we've recorded our conversation on Wednesday, June 18th. Since the beginning of the crisis, Moscow is projecting an image of an active player in regional diplomacy. On Friday, June 13th, when this level of escalation has only started, President Putin has spoken to both Israeli prime minister and to Iranian president. And then next day called President of the United States, Donald Trump, and offered help with mediation between Iran and Israel. How do you both see Moscow's diplomatic moves now? And is this offer of interest to parties at war at all? Let's start with you, Arkady.
Hello, Alexander. Hello, Nicole. Starting 2015, the beginning of the Russian military presence in Syria, Russia is trying to be an influential actor in the Middle East region and keep its positions. Russia has not recovered yet after the Assad's regime suddenly collapsed last December, as we know, and it can't afford losing another important partner in its anti-Western coalition. It might sound as a paradox, but with Mr. Trump's return to the White House, Russia has received an opportunity to keep its position in the Middle East. It all started last February, when the US suggested Russia to mediate between them and Iranians in their negotiations about Iran's nuclear program. And it made Putin very happy, but unfortunately for him, Iranians declined. Also, the phone calls that you spoke about didn't have any result, but Russia is not giving up. Today, on June 18th, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Ryabkov warned the US against direct military assistance to Israel, or even, and I quote, considering such speculative options. So I'm convinced that Russia will continue to try to help Iranian regime to survive, and for them it's a very important goal.
I think that Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov has mentioned very early on that, our offer of diplomatic support is having traction by various parties, but not by Israel. Do you agree, Arkady? And if yes, can you explain why?
Yes, because I think that the main goal today, right now, for Israel is continue this military operation. It's very important because now we have a free sky to try to cancel and liquidate the Iranian nuclear program. And maybe this is our last chance to do it. So Israel, in my opinion, will continue this military operation because this is an existential threat to Israeli security and Israeli government. And I have to confess that I'm in opposition to Netanyahu government. But today, it's really a very important and right decision of the Israeli government to continue this military operation and to give to all the world the free of nuclear program Iranian existence. And it's very important for us.
Okay, that's a clearly stated position. Nicole, how does Tehran view this Moscow diplomatics outreach and attempt to be involved? And in your view, does Moscow have any diplomatic leverage at all at this point?
So it's actually interesting that Arkady mentioned that the Israelis didn't want Russia involved in kind of the mediation on the nuclear issue earlier, because the Iranians didn't either, actually. I mean, despite the Russian statements, there was traction. Actually, the Iranians were averse to this because they preferred direct negotiations with the United States. And that's partly because Iran has a history of being skeptical about Russian intentions when it comes to mediation, especially because in the past, the Russians did negotiate with the United States at the sake of Iranian interests. I think that the current military escalation might change Tehran's calculus on kind of the value of Russian mediation, in this, to the extent that perhaps Russia would serve as somewhat of a, I guess, lobbyist for Iranian interests when they're discussing this issue with the United States. But again, I mean, I don't think that the Russians really have that much leverage on the issue, both towards Iran and towards Israel. Potentially with Iran, if there's, the need for direct military assistance, so that could be hardware or kind of intelligence sharing, but not boots on the ground. I think that could be a potential lever for the Russians. But with the Israelis, the Russians, I think, lost a lot of legitimacy, especially after October 7th. And even, with the war in Ukraine, that the relationship was really becoming quite sour. So, I mean, in theory, I guess the Russians could play a constructive role on restraining Iran, but Iran just seems to be going on their own kind of agenda at the moment.
Okay. And then if we take a step back, Russia has recently, in January, signed a strategic partnership agreement with Iran. In theory, you would expect that Russia would exercise a much more muscular support to its strategic partner in letter and also in spirit. And yet Moscow's visible steps are now limited to offering itself as a mediator and then condemnation of the Israeli attacks. But that's about it. Why, in your view, is that? And is there anything behind the scenes happening that we might not see, or there is particular reasoning why Moscow is not so involved as some people would expect?
Well, so on the strategic partnership agreement, there's no mutual defense clause. I mean, Iran and Russia only vow to not support the aggressor in the event of an attack. And that's conscious. I mean, neither Russia nor Iran were, willing to go and fight in each other's wars. I mean, there's provisions within that agreement that include intelligence sharing. There's provisions that potentially include defense cooperation, but nothing that vows each other to their support. And I don't think we should be so surprised. I mean, Russia hasn't even been there for some of its treaty allies, like Armenia, when Armenia invoked the CSTO. So we're not really working under a country that has a strong alliance commitments to their partners. And Iran and Russia are certainly not an alliance. So I think there are covert areas of cooperation that are likely occurring. Russia has so many kind of multiple tracks when it comes to their foreign policy. You might see statements which actually, I would argue, are far more supportive of Iran than we've seen in the past when Israel has done covert operations on Iran. But that's not much substance. But you could see behind the scenes potentially intelligence cooperation. There could be cooperation when it comes to some of the non-tangible transfers of knowledge. So some things on defense systems or on radar. I mean, there's kind of areas where the Russians could be quite helpful for the Iranians, but that also takes time as well.
Let's not take a step back, but take a step up and even 10,010 feet view. Of course, it's too early to tell how this will end. We are recording that episode on Wednesday, June 18th, and every time that you're away from your phone for 30 minutes, you feel that you are missing out and something is happening definitely day by day. But looking back over the last 3 years, in particular in the aftermath of Russia's cruel invasion of Ukraine in February 22, and then Hamas' horrible attack against Israel on October 7th, how would you, Arkady, describe major shifts in Russia's strategic position in the Middle East? I think before, the consensus was that Russia was trying to play a role, to be present, but was trying to balance its bilateral relationships with all the key players. It was not advocating any ideological vision of democratizing the Middle East or supporting authoritarian per se, but rather trying to have a balanced relationship between Russia's Israeli ties with Russia, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Turkey. How has this shifted over the last 3 years? And what is the likely direction of travel given this new powerful blow to Iran, which is arguably Moscow's key regional partner in the Middle East.
Yes, Iran is really a regional partner of Moscow, but it's very important to understand that the major shift in Russian foreign policy happened with the beginning of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And we have to understand we are dealing with a different country than it was before. Russia went back, I will say, to its Soviet past and now sees the Western countries as its enemy. That we have to understand it's a very important point. Iran, on the other hand, has become its strategic partner. And Iran helped Russia with UAVs, with shells, short and medium range missiles. It also shared with Russia its experience how to bypass Western sanctions. This is an interesting point, yes. Practically, Russia supports axis of resistance that includes also Hezbollah, Islamic resistance in Iraq, Yemeni Houthis, and in some way also Hamas. Hamas is not proxy of Iran, but there's a very close relationship between Hamas and Iran. And after the October 7 attack, Russia didn't condemn Hamas even one time. There was no condemnation from Russian side. And Russia took a clearly anti-Israeli position. And we should also remember that Russia directly supplied weapons to Hezbollah from its ships at Tartus port. It was around 70% of all the weapons that came from Russia to Syria. 70% Russia supplied directly to Hezbollah. And of course, Russia assisted the Houthis with its military consultants. Regarding your question about this powerful blow to Iran, it all depends on the results of this blow. If the Iranian regime falls, the whole situation in the Middle East will change dramatically. And I think the Russia position will weaken, not only strategically, but also economically, because the oil and gas prices will go down. If the regime survives, Russia will continue to try to play an important role in the region and support its ally Iran.
Well, it's impossible to know whether regime will collapse as a result of this war or no. We definitely are not going to make this a prediction. But then I see the most immediate impact on Russia beyond the oil market, and we can talk about that too, is that Russia was heavily reliant on Iran for supplies of the military material for its invasion of Ukraine, as you, Arkady, mentioned. Nicole, do you think that Iran needing to reprioritize its own defense and then some of the depots might be hit already, that will affect the level of supplies from Iran to Russia? And by the way, how much is Russia currently relying on Iran for Shahed drones and so on? Because it seems to me that a lot of this production has already been localized. And if Russia needs anything from Iran, there might be some components that can probably be replaced.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, with the Shaheds, they're primarily, actually completely domesticated at the moment in Russia. So whereas there are Iranian engineers, from what we know from leaked documents, that were initially helping with the setup of these factories, right now it's pretty much a Russian operation. And that's evident in actually the upgrades that the Russians have made to the Shahed. So on that dimension of the relationship, the Russians really don't need Iran so much anymore. Of course, there were reports, and we've not seen physical evidence of this, but reports of the delivery of short-range ballistic missiles to Russia from Iran. Iran has ample supplies of short-range ballistic missiles. I think really what Iran needs at the moment is medium-range ballistic missiles, and that's kind of, the ones that are able to hit Israel. And a lot of those stocks and a lot of the kind of planetary mixers were targeted in October. And then I think today there are some reports that some of these ballistic missile production facilities were also targeted. So Iran's ability to supply missiles, I think, will be hit. There's also the question, and this is actually gets some of the debate of whether or not Iran actually delivered the launchers for some of these systems. Israel's targeted a lot of Iran's launchers for their medium-range systems, not so much short-range. However, if the U.S. gets involved in the conflict, I would imagine Iran actually may be requesting to have some of those back. And I mean, I think one thing is there's a lot of discussions about how Russia is not providing direct military aid for Iran. Iran doesn't look like it's at the brink of collapse. I think that could change quite quickly. However, I mean, even with the war in Ukraine, we didn't see the physical confirmation of Iranian deliveries until quite late, a few months into the war. So these don't really happen overnight. This wasn't so much anticipated that this would happen without the United States involved. So I think for the Iranians, I know it kind of took them by surprise. However, we could see this relationship evolving to the Russians eventually providing some level of support, whatever they could expend.
In the short term, what can you expect Russia meaningfully doing for Iran? Something that has material impact. That's one. And then going forward, let's assume a scenario where the regime stays in place and is not destroyed. What kind of assistance do you think Iran might seek from Russia? I remember you, Nicole, wrote really very interesting piece very early on this year in January. I think that Or Rabinovitz was your co-author in Foreign Affairs. That was called Will Iran and Russia's Growing Partnership Go Nuclear?, where you argue that Russia is actually technically feasible and maybe politically willing to help Iran get much more advanced in its nuclear program. And that's not only in terms of delivery means, but also making the warhead smaller so that it will have bigger nuclear payloads and so on. So you picture really very dangerous direction of travel. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think in the immediate term, I mean, the next month or so, you're not going to see, Russian advisors in Iran. There were reports in October that Russian air defense operators did travel to Tehran to kind of train and assist the Iranians. But right now, it seems like a lot of Iranian air defenses are pretty much destroyed already. So if the Russians were able to repair that, I think that's a little bit more longer term. The direct assistance, or kind of the main assistance right now, I think Russia can offer is potentially satellite imagery, some intelligence sharing with the Iranians. That seems to be kind of the big areas where they could support Iran at the moment. And of course, I think in the broader scheme of things is also becoming this kind of rallying call against the United States being involved. Providing some kind of forum for the Iranians to articulate their grievances, and so the Russians can do that, I think, in the short term. But I don't think we're going to see really substantial, deliveries of hardware in the next few months. I think that that's just not feasible with the Russian economy and also with the Russian defense industry at the moment. But in the future, I think, so if the regime survives, I mean, there's few directions that this could go. Is you see a really hardened Islamic Republic that's bent on developing nuclear weapons. Where the state of Iran's nuclear program will be, in the future, it's unknown. But if Iran does choose to reconstitute it, and if they do go down that path where they view nuclear weapons as integral to their security, the Russians could play a very significant role. We know that they played a role in the 90s with some of Iran's work. These are scientists that basically lost their jobs after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They went to Iran and kind of helped with some of their research on the fuel cycle, but also potentially the weaponization side of things. Actually, some Ukrainian scientists as well. So they could do that. I think Iran has... there's some suspicions that the Russians have been helping with the development of Iran's kind of excuse or cover for an ICBM, which is their space launch vehicle program. There's some evidence that the Russians have been helping them there, and also in the weaponization process. So I think if you have scientists from Russia, whether officially or unofficially, you could see that happening. And partly because I think the Iranians might be asking for it, but Russia might use that as a hedge against losing a crucial partner to Western-led regime change. But that's kind of speculative. I mean, you could also see the Islamic Republic kind of transform into something much more moderate, and where Russian assistance isn't really needed. But I think it's kind of hard to fully project what we think is going to happen sometimes.
Nicole, and can you imagine the Russians helping the Houthis more and doing more what they've been already doing?
Yeah, it depends. So the Russians actually developed independent ties to the Houthis. I mean, the IRGC initially set up some of their contacts, and then the Russians started taking on individual cooperation with the Houthis on their own. And that includes satellite imagery, and then it also included potentially the transfer of cruise missiles, and that didn't really come through. I think the Russians could see that as a way. I mean, but in the immediate context, you're likely going to see Russia being more focused on bolstering Iran than the Houthis at the moment. I mean, the Houthis were kind of a way of horizontally escalating the war in Ukraine and, supporting this axis of resistance. But if the critical node of the axis resistance is kind of in peril, there might be a kind of shift on prioritization. There's also different kind of systems that they would offer the Houthis compared to the Iranians. Like, these are different militaries. Sure, they operate similar systems, but the Houthis are much more reliant on shorter range systems, which Iran, again, kind of has a surplus of. So I think that's feasible, but I don't think that's going to be the main thrust of the Russian kind of partnership at the moment.
Arkady, having heard Nicole's description of what various tools Moscow can, in theory, deploy to help its partners in Tehran, it's a limited toolkit, but still it's something to consider. I know that you're long outside of the Israeli system, but how you would think colleagues in Tel Aviv would think about those issues? Is that on their radar? And would they have a special line to talk to Moscow and try to deter Moscow from using some of these tools? What would be the Israeli approach to handle Moscow at this very delicate time?
Oh, it's a very delicate issue because now, especially now, I think after the beginning of this military operation against Iran, I think that something also will happen inside the Israeli military establishment and security establishment. Because till today, there was some feeling that Israel tried to be semi-neutral or neutral if we are talking about the war in Ukraine, or if we are talking about the Russian presence in Syria, or the Russian policy and strategy in Syria and with Iran, everything that connected to axis of resistance. Today, I think that there is understanding that Russia is not a reliable partner. And I think after the condemnation of Israeli military operation in Iran, I think this feeling will accompany us, and our military and diplomatic establishment will understand that today, it's a time that Russia is not reliable partner. We can't trust Russia in this case. And I think that the most dangerous thing for Israel is that if one day the White House thinks about the agreement, the new agreement on nuclear issues with Iran, I think Israel has to be very negative regarding Russian role to keep Iranian uranium, and it's the main issue. Because the White House and the President Trump said that there's some role, or they are thinking about some role for Russia in this potential agreement. They mean that Iran will transfer this uranium to Russia territory. And we have to remember that from Bushehr station, nuclear station, this uranium really Iranians transferred to Russia. But in this case, I'm not sure that Israel can trust Russia. And one day, maybe Russia will give back to Iranians all this uranium for this military project. And this is a real problem for Israel.
For now, as I hear you both, I see, frankly, only trouble for Russia as a result of this significant and somewhat unexpected developments. Yes, the oil price is up by around $10 a barrel. How long that will last, only God knows. We are definitely not in the business of predicting the oil price. So maybe Russia will plug a hole in its household this year because of that. But long term, Arkady, do you see anything that could be positive from the Kremlin's viewpoint in all of this regional dynamics nowadays?
First of all, I agree with you that in the short term, Russia definitely benefits from this crisis because nobody pays attention anymore to what it does in Ukraine. And Russia keeps bombing its civil population in Ukraine. Russia also very active on the multilateral arena. We see it in the UN. By the way, Russia all the time condemning Israel's attack on Iran. It's also in a parallel. All prices are going up, 12% higher, and fills the Russian budget that struggles to finance military expansion. And there's a lot of problems with the Russian budget. But this is everything in short term. I don't know if it will be, if this term it's weeks or months, but I think it's really will be short term. In the longer term, Russia will lose I will say maybe it's a bit philosophic, but it's very important. Russia will lose because it chose to be on the wrong side of history. And all the anti-Western feelings that Russia can't achieve a victory. And I hope that the Western world and Western countries, including USA, now we have a bit quarrels and some problems between Europe and the United States, but it's very important to understand that we have to keep Russia and we have to think how we can contain, because till Putin is in power, we have a real problem.
Final question to both of you. Going forward with all of the unpredictability, what indicators will you be watching in the coming weeks to assess what's the impact of the ongoing crisis on Russia's position in the region? Nicole, I go with you.
I'm going to be looking primarily at just the way that the Russians have been portraying this conflict and whether there is like a rapid jump in concern around the kind of security of the regime. One thing is if there are protests in Iran, I think that you're going to see the Russians actually playing a pretty important role in like riot suppression. They've transferred tactics to the Iranians. They're good at assisting them with shutting down the internet. So when it comes to domestic population control, I think the Russians might have a role there. And of course, they're quite sensitive to any kind of upheaval domestically in Iran. So that could be maybe a trigger for more overt support for the Iranians. I mean, I think one area to look at if you want to see like potential transfers or anything is to look at the Caspian Sea, because that's where most of it has gone through. So that's something that I'm thinking about, but that's probably more longer term. And of course, I think Arkady mentioned this is Russia's role in the Iran nuclear file. Is Russia going to try to get the uranium stored on their territory? Are they going to try to strike some arrangement where Iran doesn't enrich, but they're allowed to enrich on Russian territory? The Russians are very creative when it comes to the Iran nuclear issue. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see some of that coming up in these discussions as well.
That's a very comprehensive list. And with that, this episode is over. If you want to leave us your feedback and comments, please don't hesitate to do so. And also don't forget to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're using to receive your podcast to never miss a new episode. I'm very grateful for being on the podcast again. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ambassador Mil-Man. We should have you back.
Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye.